This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
That was kind of a light bulb went on above my head that, like, it's one thing to know how to program, but it's a much harder thing to know what to do with the skills that you have. He identified what the problem was and proposed a fix, and they fixed the product. And then afterwards, I remember him saying, well, and don't ever come back.
This is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Dave Menconi started at Atari in 1982, doing customer support for the Atari computers. Later, he moved to the marketing group, where he helped support the Atari users groups. Dave wrote the program Dancin Man for Antic magazine and wrote several articles for Atari Connection magazine. In this interview, we discuss Chris Crawford, Ted Richards, and Mike Albaugh, all of whom I have previously interviewed. This interview took place on April 19, 2016.
When I was in high school, there was a physics teacher who had a lot of cool physics stuff, and including an ancient a digital logic system that had little cards. And so I learned how to take apart, how to test it and how to take out the cards and replace them with other cards. It was from the 60s. It was just, I guess it was his master's thesis or something. And then he got a computer. His father died and he got some money. It was a Catholic school, so he was a priest, so he couldn't just blow the money on himself. But they let him buy a computer. So we had this, it's actually a programmable calculator, programmable in BASIC. And I learned how to program in BASIC, and I spent every minute I could. And so I learned, how to program in simple BASIC, and then a friend had a computer and I learned assembly language. And so on my own, I learned a lot of different little things. And then we were war gamers. We played board war games. This would be in the late 70s. And there was a wargaming convention in Salinas, California. And so we packed up our cars. We were in Sacramento at the time, and we packed up our cars and drove down to Salinas. And we went to this convention. And at the convention was this weird little man who had a Kim. I think it was a Super Kim, which is a ancient computer based on the 6502. And he had running on it a game called Tactics. And he had a couple boards there, and the computer moderated the game so that you couldn't see where I was and I couldn't see where you were, and the computer told us what we saw. And that little man was Chris Crawford. And I got to talking to him because I was both interested in the war game aspect and in the computer aspect. And he realized that, he had just met somebody who knew something about computers, and so we became friends. And eventually, he got me a job at Atari. He was actually the very, very first money I ever made professionally was translating Tactics from Fortran into Commodore BASIC without a computer. I just sat there and read the Fortran and just blind copied it into BASIC. And he said that it worked pretty well. There were a couple of mistakes. The most interesting thing about Chris Crawford, well, I guess not the most interesting thing, but something that most people don't know is he has handwriting that is neater than most computer typing. It was extremely consistent. So you could read his handwriting really, really well. And if you've ever seen some of the stuff he did for Atari, sometimes some of his text that he wrote things out in was released. And it's just amazing how neat his writing is.
I think I've seen some of it in some of the papers that I've digitized over the years. So he was already working at Atari at that point, sounds like.
Yeah, he was working in some sort of research group.
Right.
And so he got me a job in customer service, which maybe isn't the cherry job everyone wants as a programmer, but it got me out of Sacramento and into the Silicon Valley, which was literally like coming home to a place you'd never been before. That's a lyric from a song, but it was true for me. In Sacramento, you say, hi, I know about computers, and they go, oh, go away. We're not interested in you at all. But in San Jose, you could stand up in a McDonald's and say, excuse me, but does anybody know how to do this in BASIC? And someone would go, oh, yeah, sure, no problem. I mean, it was almost like that. It was like a whole city full of geeks.
Nice. All right, so you're hired in customer service. Tell me about the first day. Tell me what you're doing and
oh Lord,
start me off.
So I was in technical customer service. So I was second tier. So I mostly wasn't on the phones, although there were a couple times when I got put on the phone. So mostly what would happen is somebody would ask a question that the customer service people didn't know how to answer. Like how does Antic work? Or, my program doesn't work. What's wrong with it? Or something like that. And I got the training for how to take apart an Atari 800, which is pretty interesting. Everyone freaked out when you took apart an Atari 800 because it's like, what's he doing? He's taking it apart. Oh my God, he's going to break it. But of course, if you know how to take it apart, you take it apart, you put it back together, and it works fine. So I also got, of course, programming training. I had access to all the documentation, so I was able to trace through what the boot up sequence was and things like that most people don't even know about. And that's pretty interesting. For example, I hardly ever played Atari 800 games. What I mostly did was try to crack their security, because that was a lot more fun. And if you knew, if you had the boot up sequence, you could go through and you'd go, okay, it's doing this now, and then it's doing this, and there's no way it can get out of it. It has to work on the machine, so you can always figure out what it's doing. So probably the most interesting thing that ever happened while I was in customer service was I got a phone call. I was on the phones because they were behind. And so I got a phone call from somebody, and she said, so, my son wants to know how to program. And I said, well, okay. So you want to get Day Ray Atari, which was Chris Crawford's book about the Atari. And you want to get, and then I mentioned a couple other documents that we had that told you how to program and taught you the internals. And she said, no. He wants to know how to program. He has all those books, but he wants to know how to program. And it stopped me, and I sat there thinking, what is she talking about? And I said, well, so he knows how to program. What do you mean? Well, no, but he doesn't know what to program. And that was kind of a light bulb went on above my head, that like, it's one thing to know how to program, but it's a much harder thing to know what to do with the skills that you have, like what creative energies you might use in it. But mostly, to be honest, working at Atari in those early days was just, answering phones, responding to emails, doing that stuff that towards the end of the days of Atari, the customer base started doing things like buying computers and then sending back boxes, returning them, but not returning the computer, returning like a box full of rocks. And so we had to figure that sort of thing out.
Wow.
Because if it weighs the same and it looks the same, then they'll give you your money back. And it's not till later when it gets back to the headquarters that we figure it out.
So that actually worked for a while?
It worked a couple times.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, remember that they were selling Ataris all over the country, and
sure.
And so we have to kind of depend on the retail,
right.
The person getting paid at that time $4 an hour or $2 an hour to, accept returns.
Right. So what year were you hired? We kind of glossed over that.
Oh, yeah. It must have been 1981.
Okay. All right. So you're in customer service, and then what?
Well, then I went to work for, I met this guy named Earl Rice, who was in charge of the user group.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was pretty interesting, because what he needed somebody who understood the technical aspects of the machine, because the user group people were very interested in, digging in, and he didn't have anybody on his team who could dig in like that. There was a marketing guy, and Gretchen, who was like the article says she doesn't like to be called the secretary. She was sort of the group administrator. I guess that's what we call her nowadays. And then there was Earl, who was pretty technically savvy, but he was basically a marketing guy. So there's basically a marketing group, and they needed a pet geek, is basically what it was. And so I worked on that for a while. And they put out a video they put out a couple of videos that had Chris Crawford wearing a chip suit. And the goal was to try and explain how the Atari worked in non-technical terms. So he'd put on a chip suit, and he'd hold up a megaphone to his mouth and say toot toot, and it's a great video. I'm sure it's around somewhere. But
I've never seen it, but okay.
I wrote a little
chip suit, like a 6502 chip.
Yes.
All right. First, I thought you said a chimp suit. I was just like, I don't see the...
No, I'm sorry. No, a chip suit.
Okay.
But he wasn't a 6502. He was either Antic or Pokey or one of the other. You may recall that the Atari 800 had a bunch of different custom chips in it. And so we were trying to explain what these custom chips were for and how you could program them and how you could use them, because they were really quite powerful for their day. Not to brag, but the Atari 800 had much better graphics than than the Apple II, and much easier to use because of these chips.
You're not bragging. You're not bragging. You're preaching to the choir.
Preaching to the choir, yeah. Well, at the time, it was kind of a big deal. You're kind of getting me back into my head back into the days of Atari. So one of the things that we did was missile player graphics was one of the things Antic did. There's these little graphic elements you could put on the screen, and instead of having to erase them and then redraw them over and over and over again, which is how you would normally do it in assembly language, you could simply bang numbers into registers and they would move around. They would reappear in different places on the screen. So you could have, one of them was called a player, and then there were 4 or 8, I think it was 4, what they call missiles. And altogether they would be like, I don't know, I forget now, but I think it was like 32 or 64 bits across. So it was relatively small, and they were like black and white. They weren't wonderful, things, but they were a way that you could have a game that had an object in it that flew around and that the player could shoot out with missiles. And I used it to create a Death Star, or maybe it was a TIE fighter, I forget, but some sort of little graphic that would fly onto the screen, get larger and larger and larger, and then I split it up into pieces so that you could see that it was really multiple things, and then it flew away again. And that was they videotaped that and added it to one of the videos. So I got to actually do some programming for that.
Nice. Only 8 bits wide.
8 bits wide. Okay.
But then you could double or quadruple them, but it was just wider. It wasn't
right.
Better
it was
resolution.
Just more pixels per.
But it was as tall as you wanted. Oddly, you could take the whole screen. 8 bits wide, but it's infinitely tall. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'd forgotten some of those details.
It's okay. Okay, so great. So you're in the user group and having fun there. And then?
So, and I should mention I also wrote some articles for Antic, one of which you sent to me, but another which a friend of mine mentioned to me when I was at PlayStation. He said, oh yeah, you wrote this article that I read, which I thought was pretty cool, because I wrote an article and published it in a magazine 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and people still remember it, which is kind of the power of Atari, is that it sort of shaped people that are now in the industry.
So the only article I see from you, and I certainly could be wrong here, is the Dancin Man one, which was in the June 1983 issue.
That was the one that he saw.
Mm-hmm. How'd you get that? Were you working at Atari at the time? Did you submit it like a regular person, or how did it?
So no, Ted Richards was part of the marketing group. So when I was working in customer support, when I was working at the user group, I was part of marketing communications, and so he would say, well, he was a pretty cool guy. He wrote comic books on the side. Right. And so he would, well, what can we do? What, got any ideas? And so I'd come up with crazy little programs and little things, and I'd give them to him, and he'd publish them. And he also had me write, I remember, a review of Logo, although my conclusion was that it wasn't something you wanted to mess with. And of course, he changed that.
No, you can't put that in the Atari Connection magazine.
No, of course not. It was very foolish of me. I was very young and naive then.
That was a marketing arm of Atari.
Yeah, that was a no-no. But
all right, go ahead.
I was just going to say he was savvy enough not to let me have my way. I was very annoyed. I thought that was terrible. But the truth is, what did I know? I was 20. He fixed it, and it was published. So I had a couple articles, not a lot. And then after the user group, I got a job working with advanced games. I was working on a text adventure with graphics in it with Steve Englehart, who actually has some fame as a comic book author who worked on Batman. Some of the early, I guess some of the middle Batman stuff. Mm-hmm. And he also wrote a novel. I've thought about this for decades.
So how did you get this? So this was at Atari, you were doing this text adventure?
Yeah. So I was working. Yeah, exactly. So there's an advanced game group who worked in both coin-op and on the 2600 and on Atari games. And so I was working a little group. We're gonna put in the middle of it some kind of video game thing, and then the company went under before it was finished.
So before we get to the company going under, and I assume you losing your job. So the customer service, the user group stuff, and then seems like you kind of got sucked into the more of a marketing arm, writing for Atari Connection and things.
Well, that was really part of the user group. I was just the user group was marketing.
Right. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I found some interesting articles from you in the Atari Connection. There was the one that was like basically, I didn't type in the program, but it seemed like it was a riddle, and you had to type in this program to get the answer to the riddle. It was kind of a long program. I think that was the one I sent you the link for.
Yeah. So that I looked at that, and it's like only dim memories. I don't really remember what that was, but it looks to me like the code creates a second hidden page and then flips back and forth really fast. And so it flashes the hidden. I wrote some stuff in the hidden page, and then it flashes the hidden page up. So the idea was, if I remember correctly, and then if you hit the start key, it'll hold the page so you can see it for longer. And so the idea is to try and catch it by pressing the start key. But the real purpose of it was to try and be to try and tease you into looking a little more deeply at the different capabilities. So having 2 pages was a capability that most people didn't know about. And so there's a little bit of code in there, and if you had a memory map and you could figure out what that code did, I don't think it used any assembly language. It looks more like it just banged numbers into registers. I could be mistaken, but I don't think it uses any really hard code. Right. And so the idea was just to tease people into trying to figure out how to sort of hint to you that there's an underlying level below the one that you know about, and and it's kind of cool because it also looks like magic a little bit. How do you do that? So yeah, that was I think that was the purpose of that article, is just to try and get people to see that there was more to it than just the basic.
Cool. I found a lovely picture of you from Antic magazine, June 1982. User group support.
The giant beard.
You and Gretchen, not the secretary, and Mark, somebody, Carter. Yeah, you're telling me about a giant beard.
Yeah, I know. Nothing like yours. Nothing as nice as yours is.
So I assume 1984, when things fell apart, is when you lost your job. Tell me about that.
So as I recall, it's a little dim, but as I recall, what happened was I got the company actually split. I'm not sure people know this, but there was the part that Trammell bought, and then there was another part that did coin-op, and he didn't buy the coin-op part. And so for a time, some number of months, while they considered keeping me, I was working for the coin-op part. And eventually they decided that they just didn't have the budget to keep me. Like, they had a sort of conceptually a list of 100 names or whatever, and I just was too low on the list.
So this was when you were in the advanced games group?
Yeah. So the fact that I was in the advanced game group got me considered by coin-op, and later I remember calling someone at Atari, someone in to deal with like my 401k or something later, and she said, "So you were out at this date?" And I said, "No, my date was such and such." She says, "No, that's impossible. You couldn't have been." So I think what happened was I continued working for longer than everybody else, maybe into late '84, maybe even into '85, just because I was sort of picked up by coin-op for a while, and then laid off from there. So I wasn't really technically laid off when Trammell bought the company. I was laid off 4 months or 6 months later, which, I'll take it.
You're right, sure. Did you work with Eric Woolmander when you were in the
yeah, I remember Eric.
Yeah. I interviewed him recently. He had the source code for an unreleased follow-up to Star Raiders.
Nice.
But not the game that was released by Atari called Star Raiders. It had never been released before. It was way more true to the original Star Raiders game. And it was and now it's out there thanks to Eric and the source code, and he just saved it all. So it was amazing. So yeah, you mentioned me about some text adventure you're working on in that group. I'm just like, there was more. What other things were you guys working on? That it sounds like amazing stuff came out of there.
Hoppy the Hobgoblin. I think it was probably a terrible game. It's probably lucky. The world is probably lucky that we never released it. But it taught me how to program in assembly language. I mean, how to program in C. I did a lot of basically all the code needed to be compressed. I mean, all the text needed to be compressed. So I learned how to write a C program that sucked up all the text and compressed it using various algorithms. It was pretty cool. I enjoyed it. Doing games is fun. Usually.
Yeah, I bet.
Except when it isn't.
All right, so you were laid off, and how long was it before you were rehired in the coin-op group?
Oh, so I think I was laid off someplace in the mid '80s and hired back sometime in the mid '90s.
All right, so what'd you do in the meantime?
Just anything I could get. So for a while I remember I was working as a game tester, which is a job I never want to have again because it makes you hate playing games, because you play the game until you find something that doesn't work, and then you play that part over and over and over again until you can write down how you did it. And I didn't find that very fun. And then, of course, once you've written down that, then you have to go to some other part and find something else that doesn't work. So it's not fun. You'd think it would be fun playtesting games, but I didn't find it enjoyable at all. So then I jumped at a job working in, believe it or not, Ada on a relational database. And then I forget where I went after that, but basically I worked as a contractor, I worked as a programmer in game teams, I worked at a lot of different places. And eventually I found my way back to Atari, working on a game, I'm trying to remember the name of it. It was a fighting game. And the basic premise of the game was that, well, from my perspective, the technology behind the game was that they did a bunch of 3D models and animated them, and then I took the 2D frame-by-frame animations, and I put that in the game. And it was one of the first games that had a hard disk in it. So I had a lot of space. And so I wrote the pipeline that would take all those different things and change the graphics on them, colorize them, and do various things, and compress them and shove them onto the hard drive, and then the game would run. I was the lead, and I did just a whole lot of work. I remember spending, must have been 3 months, 2 months, certainly a month and a half, going in and working for 12 hours a day on a collision algorithm. The idea was that I had an algorithm, a perfectly fine algorithm that would tell you the distance between a point and a line, which is the fundamental basis of the fighting game. Because you had a fist, and then you had a body that was a collection of lines, and if you could tell how far the fist was from all the lines, you could decide whether that was a hit or not, right? And so what I was doing was I had a perfectly good algorithm that I had stolen from Graphic Gems for how to find the distance between a point and a line, but I was using a bunch of other less accurate algorithms that were faster and trying to say, okay, test this, test this, test this. If you know it's not in the bounding box, you know that it didn't make a collision, but it could be in the bounding box and still not make a collision. So by sequencing those tests in exactly the right order, you could do it as fast as humanly possible and still have it be very accurate. And so I spent months working on that. And that was like the basis, the real core of the game, and the thing that took the most time that I really worked on. And then we actually got other programmers on the team, and we did the actual game, with the whole thing. And eventually I left Atari because it didn't seem to me that Atari had a whole lot of future, which was, of course, correct. But so I went to EA. And before I actually got to EA, to go to the coin-op group at EA, and you say, what coin-op group at EA? And the reason you say that is because they canceled the coin-op group. It was there for a year, and then they canceled it just before I got there. After I signed an agreement, but before I actually started. So I spent my time at EA moving coin-op machines into a room where they were going to sell them. But being at Atari was really interesting because that was the time during which we were bought by Time Warner. And I remember that there was a bunch of people wandering around the halls of Atari saying, so how do you do interaction? Like, how does interaction work? Because they're all magazine people, right? And they knew nothing about how you write a story and you hand the story to someone and they read the story. That's their idea of interaction. And of course, in games, it's like incredibly more dynamic than that. And so they just didn't get it. They didn't know how to do it. So they're basically saying, so how do I take my static magazine and I make it interactive? How do we add interaction to the thing we're doing? And the answer is you can't, at least as far as I can tell. There were text adventures, which sort of added interaction to text, but we were pretty far past that by 1994. And so there was really no good answer for them, and they were just kind of annoying. But that's the main thing I remember about it is that aspect of it, that there were people wandering around going, so let's add interaction to things. Sure, I'll give you a beaker of it, and you can just pour it over stuff.
That sort of thinking led to hundreds and hundreds of very poorly thought out, boring CD-ROMs where you could click on things to open the door and see what was behind the door.
So I'm not sure you're interested in this, but I work for a company called Rocket Science Games. And Rocket Science Games spent 2 years writing a thing that would take a video and allow you to insert places where you could interact with the video. So, for instance, there's a train running down the track, and there's a switch point where it can turn left or right. And so it allowed them to take a video of the train running down the left side, and the train running down the track and then turning left, and the train running down the track and turning right, and put switch points in and create a game out of that. And they had this whole system. They did, if it was possible to do interactive video games like that, with movies, interactive movies, they could do it. And they basically failed, and then they decided that instead of doing that, they would switch to 3D, because you could do almost the same thing in 3D. With 3D video games, you could do a very movie-like experience, but it was dynamic instead of being static like that. And so they switched over to that, and the guy, I forget the name of the guy who was the head of it, but he managed to get more funding. So he basically pivoted the whole company, said, okay, that doesn't work, let's pivot it, which I always admired him for. And then they did a game called Rocket Jockey, which was brilliant. It was all about rocket-powered motorcycles that you fly around in an arena, and you can shoot out wires to catch things. And so there's these poles at either end, and you'd shoot out wires and grab onto the poles and whip around. And if you were close to the pole when you did it, you'd whip around really fast. And if you're further apart, you'd do this big arc. But you could also whip out wires to grab your opponents, drag them off their motorcycles, chain them to the poles. It was a wonderful game, but didn't really work in the market. I never really understood why some things work in the market and some things don't. I thought that game was really good. And we were working on a game called Pest, which was based on, there's a giant statue of a guy in a tall top hat, and he has a big hammer in his hand. This is on 101 in San Jose, or I guess it's on the peninsula. And he's got a big hammer, and there's a little mouse. He's got the hammer. I think he's holding the hammer behind his back, and the little mouse is sitting there looking at him. And the idea is that this is an extermination company, and he's going to hit the mouse with the hammer. And so we made literally a 3D model of a giant guy with a big hammer and mice. And the mice were scurrying around, and you were trying to hit them with the hammer. And there was a lot more to it than that, but that was the basic premise of the game. So we got an early version of that where the entire game is just you running around trying to hit the thing. And we found that we had a lot of fun with that, so we decided to continue it. Unfortunately, the company went out of business before we could finish that game. But that's not exactly the story of my career, but there are all too many examples of that.
Many parallels.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the games industry. They start 100 games and they finish 3 of them, and 1 of them goes up on the shelves.
Right. So where do you work now?
Well, right now I'm unemployed, actually, which is why I'm talking to you instead of working. But the last job I had was working for a company called Access Softtech. They made banking software. So I've been in management since 2000.
Mm-hmm. Got out of the programming gigs?
Yeah. Well, basically I worked for 3DO, and it wasn't a very pleasant experience because it was at the end of 3DO, and they were trying to, survive. And so they were during the late 90s, they were pretty harsh on game developers. And so I got tired of it and decided to go work for Palm. And at Palm, they made me a manager and paid me a lot of extra money. And I realized that I hadn't been getting paid very much when I was working in the games industry. And so I never really looked back. So although I worked for PlayStation, PlayStation is really a marketing company. I wasn't really a game developer by any stretch of the imagination. And so I really haven't been in the games industry except for the 9 years at PlayStation, which, as I say, is a little different than working as a game developer. Since I guess 1999.
Cool. All right. So, any more Atari stories? I'm curious, when you were in customer service, how were the users? Were they excited and happy to be there, or were they angry, terrible people that people hated to deal with?
So I'll answer that two ways. When you're in customer service, of course, the people you talk to are people who are not happy with you. Their thing doesn't work, and they want it to work. And I remember that they put me through a class called I can't remember the class, but the idea was that how you respond to handling unreasonable expectations. And the idea is that you never want to say, no, I can't do that for you. What you want to say instead is, well, so I'm sorry that it doesn't work for you. I can't fix that, but what I can do is, and you always give them something else. So I found that very useful because, of course, everyone's always angry with you. And I remember there was a time when one of the games that we were putting out, one of the products we were putting out, came on a cassette tape, and the cassette tape never worked. You could never get it to load. And so I went to the lab. I found out that it was true. I saw several cases of people complaining about it, so they sent me to the lab to talk to the guy in R&D and figure out why it didn't work. And he took one of the ones off the shelf, and he opened it up, and he looked at the tape, and the tape had like some sort of horrible corrupted section. He could look at it with a magnifying glass that was connected to had some sort of metal filings in it, so you could see what was on the tape. And he identified what the problem was and proposed a fix, and they fixed the product. And then afterwards, I remember him saying, "Well, and don't ever come back," because basically I just wasted 3 weeks of his time figuring out this problem and fixing it, and he didn't want to be the guy who had to fix problems. But I managed to get that fixed. and if it had happened again, I wouldn't have hesitated to come back to him. So the customers, by and large, were unhappy with us. But as I said before, a lot of the interactions were relatively positive because a lot of the questions that I got asked, at least, were, how do you do X? And so the answer was always, well, we have this documentation that will help you, and you could try this and try that. It would have been really good. If I could go back to 1982, I would write a source book. Like, here's 30 different programs you can try yourself. And here's another 30 that I'll give you the source code for the first 30, and there's another 30 variations of those first 30 that you can completely do yourself. And I think it would have sold really well. It was like a missing niche, I think. Because I think, as I said before, Atari was all about, being creative and learning to do stuff you didn't know how to do before, and changing the way you thought about things. In fact, that's kind of what I think programming is. And then I went to work for the user group, and that's a whole different experience because everybody was enthusiastic. Everyone was excited about Atari. Everybody wanted to know more. They wanted to become better at it. At some point, associated with Chris Crawford, I had an opportunity to talk to a user group and present. I think Chris was doing a class in assembly language, and he couldn't be there one night. So he asked me to fill in for him. So I gave a class in assembly language, and I did it very poorly. I tanked it. I got nervous and got scared and didn't do a very good job. But everyone was really friendly, and it was obvious that they were very interested in learning the material. And of course, if you've ever programmed in assembly language, it's hard. It's a lot of difficulty with very little payback. And so you think it'll be easy, but it's actually quite difficult. There's a lot of little details, and if you get one of them wrong, just one of them, you'll never know why. It just won't work. And so I was pretty impressed that those guys were night after night, like for weeks, taking this class and learning how to program in assembly language. That was. I mean, of course, I'd learned assembly language the very, very hardest way possible because I had a computer. And the only way I could program it was assembly language, so I figured out how to do it because that's how I was. But I was a computer guy, These were just people who were interested, They just wanted to see what they could do with their Atari 800. They weren't computer people; they were people from all walks of life. And here they were learning assembly language. That was really impressive to me.
Nice. What haven't I asked you about that time that I should have?
Well, I did have one story about Atari games. There was a guy, Mike Albaugh, who was a very interesting person. I don't know if you've interviewed him or if you know who he is. Oh, you do know who he is. Okay. But I got to Atari games, and I met Mike Albaugh, and he was very critical of my C programming skills. And the reason was because Mike Albaugh had programmed in every compiler known to man, every C compiler known. And so you'd write a particular construct that worked in all the C compilers you'd ever see, and he said, well, yeah, but it doesn't work in that C compiler, so you don't ever want to do that again. And so he was basically the maintainer of best practices. He was the guy. He never did a video. Well, he might have actually programmed a couple games, but he wasn't a famous Atari game developer.
He wrote the in-store demo program, which is my favorite program.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. But he worked on a thing called Guts, and Guts was the thing that handled the coin drop, and that did all the things that made the Atari games effective and reliable, and so you would write your game, and it would talk to Guts and make sure that it did the right things so that when it got on a floor of an arcade, it would work reliably and wouldn't lock up and cost money essentially. And so I was really impressed by Mike Albaugh because he, to me, as a relatively young programmer, he knew everything. I thought I knew a lot, but he knew so much more than I did. So that I kind of was thinking about this interview, and I was thinking about Mike Albaugh and thinking, wow, there's probably one of the best aspects of my working that I met people like Mike Albaugh who were so expert.
Wow, nice. Do you still have an Atari computer?
No. I haven't had an Atari computer in a very, very long time.
So if you could send a message to the people who still do have Atari computers and who are listening to this, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Well, keep up the good work. I think one of the things that's just amazing right now is that if I wanted to play, say, Atari 800 Joust, I could find an emulator that would allow me to do that. And I don't think that this is a hugely popular thing right at the moment, but I think that in a few years, this will become the source of all inspiration. Not all inspiration, but a lot of inspiration for games. Because games are going down a road right now, and there has to be some limit. When games look just like movies, we come full circle, and now we have interactive movies that are video, the modern video game. But eventually, we have to get to the end of that, and someone's going to be casting about for new inspirations and new ideas, and they're going to look back, and it's all going to reflect back. And the fact that the enthusiasts have preserved all those old games and done emulators and even have the old hardware, more power to you. That's really important, because otherwise we lose connection to our roots. And when any industry loses connection to its roots, it kind of dies a little bit. So I guess that would be my, hats off to you guys.
Great answer. Thank you. When we're done here, I'll send you a link so that you can play Atari 800 Joust in your browser using JavaScript. You don't even have to install an emulator.
Thank you. I don't know why I picked Joust. Joust was just one of 1,000 games that you could pick, right?
Right. Well, I think I have what I need. Thank you very much.
Cool. All right, well, this has been fun.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.